And for the second time, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Brittany Webb, the Evelyn and Will Kaplan Curator of 20th Century Art and the John Rhoden Collection. In this role, Webb oversees PAFA's collections, exhibitions, and programs of the 20th century art. Brittany has also led PAFA's museum team in our work to restore and preserve the John Rhoden Collection. I hope you all have had the chance to experience the transformative exhibition determined to be the Sculpture of John Rhoden, curated by Dr. Brittany Webb. And I speak for all of us here at PAFA. Congratulations and thank you, Brittany Webb, for your stewardship of John Rhoden's artistic legacy.
Thank you. I am excited for our next panel. I have the honor and pleasure of introducing to everyone Dr. Renée Ater. Dr. Ater has over 20 years of experience as an educator and is a visiting professor in Africana Studies at Brown University. She holds a BA from Oberlin College and an MA and Ph.D. in art history from the University of Maryland. As a public scholar who works at the intersection of art and history, Dr. Ater's research focuses on monuments, memory, race, and public space. She is the author of Keith Morrison, Volume 5 of the David C. Driskell series of African American art, Remaking Race and History, the Sculpture of Warrick Fuller, and has written on a range of public monuments, including the Unsung Founders Memorial at the University of North Carolina, the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the Unwavering Courage in the Pursuit of Freedom Memorial dedicated to Harriet Tubman and Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, Delaware. Currently, Dr. Ater is redesigning the Born Digital Project, Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past in Omeka, and writing a digital publication entitled Memoryscapes of Slavery in collaboration with the Center for Digital Scholarship at Brown University. We're thrilled to have her, inviting us to take a closer look at one of John Rhoden's most powerful sculptures, the slave ship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Renée Ater.
Brittany, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. And I said yes when Brittany asked me to participate. Partly because I was really, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but I was really fascinated that Rhoden created this piece of sculpture. This was supposed to take place in the gallery, but there's too many of you, and so we're going to see how this works with my slideshow. I have supplemented a little bit. So what you're looking at, and you saw these previously, are images that I just want to, is this the... Are images before the object was restored, before conservation was done on it. So what's interesting to me is looking first at these is that the figures are not as delineated as we now see them upstairs in the gallery, right? So that's one thing that's really interesting to me. And also is that the patina, right, has really been kind of reactivated, is how I like to think of it, which makes it a very different kind of object where we get those browns and greens coming so forward. And I want to really place this in the context first, because I now have a slideshow, to place it historically a little bit where this image is deriving its impulse from. I do think it's interesting that right around the time that this object is created in 1989, we've had Right Roots in 1977, the TV show. We have the book, The Mutiny of the Amistad, that comes out in 1988, I believe, 89. And we have Beloved by Toni Morrison that is also published around the same time. So there is this interest, right, in slavery. And we have the image of the Black in Western art, which is published in 88, 89, which were, for me in graduate school, like my source of materials and of images, particularly around enslaved persons globally. And so if you haven't looked at those, they've been reissued in 2014, I think 2015, but those original volumes were in effect my source material for studying slavery. And some of my very first graduate papers were about the intersection of kind of slavery and French art, actually, not even US-based art, but 19th century French art. So one of the things I want to point out, first of all, is that this image to me is absolutely indebted to this plan of an African slave ship published in 1789. This is an image that was reproduced in the Image of the Black in Western Art. It's one that is now so widely circulated that I think if I show it to you, you'll be like, oh, I've seen that image somewhere. What I just want to point out, because I do think it's fascinating, and so one of the things I'm going to do today is more what we might call kind of my own speculation as an art historian who spent a lot of time with monuments to slavery, but also just looking at imagery that's related to enslaved life, in particular in the United States. This is actually a British abolitionist imagery from the 1789, and you may be even more familiar with this. So one of the things I point out that this diagram does that's super interesting to me, because we can see it play out a bit in the slave ship sculpture, is that if we, there we go. If you'll see here that we see that the boat is split between the genders, that we have women on one side and men on the other. And one thing I would ask you to do is look really carefully at the object upstairs, where women's bodies are very much modeled on the form, so we can see them kind of grouped together. The other image, which is perhaps the most famous, is the stowage of the British slave ship Brooks, right? So the Brooks slave ship icon. And for those of you who haven't read Cheryl Finley's book called Committed to Memory about the slave ship icon, you should read it. And I can't rehash, she's done an amazing scholarly job of tackling this image. But one of the things that is interesting to me is not only do we have these layers, right? If we look here, and so this is a very serious, in some ways, very hard object to look at. We see the lined up bodies, right, in the hull of the ship. And if we look at the side here, we can see this kind of stacking of bodies, which is what Rhoden has achieved in his image upstairs in the sculpture. And so that this circulation of this image is super interesting to me. It becomes first used as a political print in the 1780s and 90s by British abolitionists. So it's a visual weapon, an object that is reprinted in both Britain and the US. We see images of it in France. And then, interesting enough, one of the things that Cheryl Finley documents as well is that there, around the 1920s, when we have the new Negro Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, there is this kind of, in the 1920s, a reappropriation of the image by Black artists. And that's super important for us to keep in mind. She calls it kind of symbolically repossessed as a symbolic marker that makes this legacy tangible. And so I want to talk a little bit about that as well. This book really, when I read it, it came out, I want to say in 2015, 26, kind of completely changed my understanding of slavery, particularly in the Middle Passage. It is by Solange Mustaqim, and she writes, "It is not enough to say that Africans were captured, transformed into commodities, shipped out of Africa, sold to interested buyers, and turned into slaves once moved into plantations. The human manufacturing process, and more importantly, the interior holds of merchant ships, served as vital sites of power sailors used to dehumanize captives, enforce dependency, inflict pain, establish authority, and prohibit any sense of control over one's personal life in the near and far future." And so for me, that representation of that image, the original schematic, may seem as a simple kind of black and white design. But what the layers, and particularly what I see happening in Rhoden's, is this attempt to get at that pain through sculpture, through modeling. And I show you two other images that are hard to look at, but they relate to this image as well historically. I think that Rhoden, who I see as someone who's incredibly engaged historically with lots of different kinds of sources, surely was aware of some of this imagery. Both of these were reproduced in the Image of the Black. So I'm speculating a little bit. But this idea of the hanging body on the slave ship or on shore, the torture of Black men and women as part of this process of enslavement is realized in Rhoden's work as well. So what I would like to do is two things. I've recently wrote an article that's coming out in an exhibition catalog about sculpture as grief and mourning. And what does it mean for an artist to use the materials of sculpture, the materials such as clay, the modeling of these forms, as an expression of grief? Like, this is for me real. It's sometimes we excise the artist from the discussion. One of the things that I think is so exciting about today's symposium is that Rhoden is front and center as the creator, that we don't get to kind of do those always loose interpretations, and so I want to stick a little bit to that. And so I was really interested. So this is the work now as it's conserved, and that's super important that we see. You should watch the film upstairs, which is quite spectacular, the literally removing of layers of grime off the object, right? And also, I don't know if you caught it, but the swinging of the central hanging figure, that this is meant to rock if one bumps into it. So the notion of movement, of suggesting the Middle Passage, the Atlantic Ocean, is as much a part of the object, right, as the modeling of these, what seem like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of forms when one engages it. So I thought this was an interesting, and I assume, Brittany, you wrote the entry for the website, so I just nabbed it off there. But in a 1990 interview with Gil Coker, Rhoden said, "Recently I started doing the slave ship. Everybody is interested in the slave ship, and when I had to do research on the slave ships and how slaves were packed into the hold of the ship, I got real sick. And I think that we all get real sick when we look at images such as these. I said, this isn't for me. But I got over this feeling, so I'm doing it. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means to get over the feeling. There are 2 or 3 other things along that line. When it comes to politics, I am very aware of social things, but it gets to me too much inside. So the first time I encountered this is so interesting, is when Brittany just started this job. And she said, hey, come upstairs. I want to come into storage with me. And I'm like, sure, let's go to storage. And so we were looking at the range of objects in the collection. And then we came upon this. And I was like, what on earth is this thing that I'm looking at? And she says, well, this is the slave ship. And it's anomalous, right? When we look at the rest of his work, it doesn't fit neatly into what we think of Rhoden's really robust career. But I have now been thinking about this object for over 5 years, since I think it was pre-COVID, like 2019, maybe 2018, that we went into storage. And that says something to me about the resonance and power of the image, that I just have not been able to shake it all these years. I think I was startled by the 3 hanging bodies at the center of the object, right here, which you can see. And this is a little fuzzy, but you can see here. But also by the sheer kind of agony conveyed through the terracotta and then the cast bronze. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the slave ship icon over time, that Finley argues this, and I'm not sure I'm 100% with her, is that she sees this used by contemporary artists of the slave ship icon as kind of a ritualized politics of remembering. I would say the fact that this was not an object that was exhibited, that this was an object that always remained within the context of Rhoden's, I assume, home studio practice. Karen Lemmy talks about going to his home and seeing it and bumping into it and seeing it rocking. And what does that mean for that encounter within domestic space of the slave ship icon moving as if there is a sea underneath it? I actually live myself with a slave ship icon created by Jefferson Pender that hangs in the hallway of my own home, and I encounter this image every single day, much to the chagrin of my mother, who wanted me to take it down because she thought it was too painful to encounter such image every day. So I think there's 2 kind of things going on in this work for me. Or more than that. It's a super complex image. So one of the things I want to point out, if you didn't get up nice and close to it, is the just layers of body that relates to the original 1780s lithographs. So that we have this layering of bodies. One of the things that Brittany notes in both the catalog and on the label is that they are anonymous figures. These are not individuals rendered, but that's also not his practice in that way. But one thing that I have been thinking about this work very deeply is what does it mean to model each one of those figures? What does it mean to place them and to stack them within the confines of this boat-like form? What does it mean to reproduce the hanging lynched body? And so here we have in the center of the image, and what is the power of sculpture to express grief and mourning, to visually respond to violence, right? So that is, in fact, a work created at the end of a career, but one that is, I think, revealing the feelings of the artist, that reveals that profound impact of dealing with this kind of imagery, with dealing with the long legacy of Black life in the United States and its origins in enslavement. So here at the central figure, the reason I showed you those early reproductions is that we see the gaping horror mouth wrenched open, right? So there's these moments in the sculpture, if you look very closely, where we see a series of figures, not all of them, with their mouths open, right? As if screaming, as in expressing the anguish of this removal, right, from home into another space that will remake them into enslaved laborers in the New World. But here we have the central figure here with their mouth dangling, and here's another figure on the other side of the gallows. What I found very interesting about this, which I talked a little bit with Brittany yesterday about, was one way that I read this, actually the central image in particular here, is to think actually about the crucifixion. There is something really profound going on in this image to actually pick three bodies, to mimic Calvary, to have a central figure tortured and then two figures on the side bound to the post. So there's this underlying, I think, Christian iconography, at least in the central image, that's really interesting, and I'd like to actually know more about that, but one that I'm speculating exists there. And that it is the central kind of organizing frame for the image as well. So some of these are Lori's photographs, and some of these are my crazy photographs from yesterday, so you'll have to just bear with the fact that some of them are based, taken with my iPhone. Now the other thing that I wanted to show you is if you look very carefully, you see the rows of stacked bodies very clearly here. But Rhoden's done something else, and this is where I began to think about grief. He has his own personal grief in response to why it took him so long to come to this image, to return to the slave image, to somehow internalize it, is that each modeling that he does, and in this case, I just want you to also notice here, I would have pointed this out upstairs, how some of the figures are wearing bound around their necks. They have metal forms around their neck, or they're bound by manacles around their feet, or bound by what looks like rope. All of this to remind us again of the unhuman quality of enslavement is realized. But also there is with this something else too that I think on either end of the boat that is also super interesting, is that the faces are slightly different, and I want to actually point this out here. This group of figures, they're bound, but there's kind of a turning upward. There's this mask-like quality, which makes sense to me given Rhoden's engagement with a range of African and Indian and Oceanic. I mean, his references are really remarkable. But there's something about this uplift face on either side of the boat as they look up at the central figures who are being hung, right, in the middle of the image, that is quite powerful. And they do not have the same kind of anguished, howling expressions that we see in other parts of the memorial. There are also these moments where we come to the memorial, and particularly this side, where we see legs that have been bound, right, either by some kind of metal wire or rope, to once again remind us of what took place in the holds of ships. One of the things that Ms. Karim talks a lot about in her book is the sexual abuse of women and exploitation of Black women on these boats. And that is very real. We'll see here where we have a row of women on this side of the monument. We recognize that by their body. So there's not individualization, but we recognize men from women. We see here a man who, right here, if I remember this right, that we can see his penis rendered. And so that's stripped naked of any clothes or identifying garments from the homeland have been removed. But he's also making reference, if you look at this kneeling figure who's been bound with their hands and this bar coming through, this is an image that shows up a lot in abolitionist imagery as well. This kind of kneeling form of subjugation that we are witnessing here as well. There's two of these figures, one on this side, and then there's kind of this interesting balance actually playing out in this image, because there's this figure is reproduced on the other side. So visually, this balance between the central frame of the gallows with these kneeling figures. Who are they next? Are they being tortured? What is the story that we are to understand here? And I hope that you will go back and look at this carefully. One of the things that it also is doing is we have various bodies that seem to be wrapped, right? So are they wrapped in shrouds? Are they about to be dumped at sea? I look at this image and I think of J.M.W. Turner's, right, The Slave Ship. Like there's a whole art history story that can be told in relationship to this object as well. And here you can see even more accentuated, this male figure looking over at these bound women, and then these two figures who are wrapped and bound as well. And so on the other side of the monument, so it's shaped in this, which I think is quite a beautiful description of a cowrie shell. But I do think that this form, the mere rocking of it to suggest the ocean, so that bottom is the boat that we're looking at. It's as if they've cut off the top of the boat and we are able to look inside. So again, this kind of balancing that he does on either end of the memorial with these figures, again, faces upturned. But if you were to move through here and look at all of these expressions and tilted heads, this as if they're lumber wedged, as a commodity, right, wedged into the boat, is very powerfully rendered in the image as well. Now on the back side, what is, because I was really kind of floored by this piece right here. What are we seeing here? And I think what we're seeing is the beginning of a shroud draped over a body that has died, right? But a body that has not been removed. So if you read let's say Marcus Rediker's book on the slave ship, right? He talks about like being chained to dead bodies, being chained to women who are giving birth, to who are ill, being in vomit and feces, and the sheer horror of that experience. And here we see that there's been an attempt in this one thing where there's a drape of a shroud, this kind of almost, it's going to seem like a strange thing for me to say, but a privacy moment at death to be shrouded, whether that's by the enslavers or by fellow people who are next to these men and women that are depicted on the slave ship. The last thing the last few things that I would like to say about this is the way that it is in the shape of this boat, which you can really realize with this flow, but also the stunning lighting. And I raise that because the inside of the boat is hollowed out. And so one of the things that's really striking to me is the play of reflections, and what we understand this to be the spine of the boat is this the watery realms of the ocean as these figures are moving and that form is rocking back and forth. I think that in such images, and I end actually with this image, I want to leave time in case people want to talk to me. This is an image I took because again, it suggests a watery realm. It suggests the Atlantic Ocean. It suggests a crossing. It is, how do we mourn in the present moment such desperate and monstrous loss? How are we to reconcile this history with American democracy? This is a question we need to be asking ourselves every single day, given the state of where we are in this world. And how does an artist model each of those forms, to take the clay, to move it through their fingers, to manipulate it, to warm it, to create bodies in this creative act. What does that mean for their own soul work, for example, to deal with that making of such a powerful and painful imagery? So this moment of creation, of not sure, of trying to, and in fact, I was really curious. I asked Brittany about what does it mean for the conservator to have worked on this, to have scraped it, to have put CO2 on it, to clean it, to bring the bronze back into presence, right? That act, even for the conservator, I suspect, was an act of mourning, of recognition of the slave trade, of the horror of it. And I keep using that word horror because that is what we are dealing with when we look at this kind of imagery. I see it as a culmination, quite frankly, of a really brilliant career, of an artist with a full range who has the capacity of working in all sorts of materials. I mean, one of the things about Rhoden that is astonishing is to move from wood to stone to ceramic to bronze, to play with patinas. But to take all these years to sort out how to create the slave ship, how to process as an artist, to me is really key to us kind of understanding and unlocking the meaning of this object. So thank you.
All right, we have some questions. I'll start here and then I'll come to the back, okay?
Thank you so much, Renee. I've been thinking about this object for years since it came into the collection, and just thinking deeply about it today, the reflection about Brittany talking about the cowrie shell, which you can also really see in the reflection, right, in the lighting. And you know, that Karen Lemmy, who, for those of you who don't know, is a curator of American sculpture at the Smithsonian, saw this in his studio. And then we got it, and it was just covered in a film and dirt, and now it's restored. It's powerful and horrifying. And I really think, just hearing you talk about it and also think about this as an object, that this could be a transformative piece in the canon of how we understand what is American art. This is a piece that we have accessioned into PAFA's collection. But as Brittany shares the Rhoden collection around the nation, it is also a piece that everybody else asks for. And I wonder how you think that, like, what is the responsible stewardship?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that.
I didn't even know I was going to ask that. I was like warming up to it, but that's what I mean, I guess.
Yeah, but the reason I knew you were going to ask that, because this is a huge issue that we've been dealing with at this big exhibition that's coming online in 2 years at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, that I've been on this advisory panel. So what do we do with these objects that are not only difficult to look at, but reveal really difficult histories or inaccurate histories? Like, that's another issue. Like the representation of indigenous bodies in the 19th century, to say problematic doesn't even begin to cover like the problem of some of this 19th century sculpture, right? And so what is the stewardship? Is it that you reproduce it on your website and let that be the site where people engage it? I would say with this object, it needs to be seen. I would actually argue even more historical context in that case as it starts to travel or move around. But I think that there are some items, for example, in the Smithsonian, I think need to stay in storage. Their lifespan is over. And I say that particularly of kind of the 19th century neoclassical moving into the early Beaux-Arts, that are stereotypes of Native identity, of Black identity, of Chinese Americans, right? Like there is a way of rendering those bodies that are 19th century and that we need to move past, yet they get reproduced a lot. And so we think that they are telling us true stories. And I say this having stood actually near an object at SAM at the American Art Museum in DC, and having a mom saying, well, this was really how it was. And thinking, but this is important, this is our publics. So if they're saying this is how it really was looking at Native American bodies, how do we disrupt that? And at that point I wasn't disruptive, because you know how I can be. Because there comes a moment where is also the point where you have to re-educate and re-educate and re-educate and re-educate. It gets burdensome actually to a point. But I think this object in particular in the context of this show is really important. I think it should travel to Montgomery. I think that's a place it needs, and I think it's an interesting dialogue in Montgomery with the National Memorial, right, to Peace and Justice, the lynching memorial. It forms a very interesting dialogue with what's happening there, with the lynched bodies, with those quarantine. Does everyone know this memorial in Montgomery? With the quarantine boxes that hang from the ceiling like this, there is a lot of potential. It's Birmingham where it's going. Is it going to Montgomery or Birmingham?
It's going to Birmingham.
Birmingham, but in the same state. And I think that's actually, and I make this point because it's really important, that these kinds of recognitions that they are there, that there is Cheryl Finley talks a lot about these as mnemonic devices, as a mnemonic aesthetic, meaning that they're memory aids. They help us to somehow reconcile this history, or not reconcile it. But there are a lot of artists who are engaging the slave ship icon in absolutely fundamentally different ways from this. The materiality of this, the three-dimensional quality of it, the rocking nature of it, the swinging body, it puts it in its own category, to be honest. I have not seen anything that quite looks like this. And I look at a lot of monuments to slavery, right? That's my work. And so I think the responsible stewardship is, it should be seen. I think you could do some really interesting work here at PAFA with a series of local contemporary artists engaging it, right? That's, to me, responsible stewardship. How do other artists see this? This is the slave ship is a ubiquitous icon at this moment in time. So how are other artists engaging it or not? What's the risk? Can you imagine this, if this was sitting out there on that plaza as a memorial? What would our understanding of slavery be if we saw something like this? Or would we ignore it? I mean, sometimes public monuments refute the very nature of what they are, right? And our ability to work through a problem. So if you can, I would travel it. I think that's part of it. I think it's people seeing it. And I also believe it's people being really uncomfortable. I actually think that's what museums are partly for. We're not just here to have pleasure experiences, I would argue, but that we have to do some hard reckoning as well in the spaces of museums.
Thank you.
I do want to say, Renee, we have established a partnership with Art Bridges.
Okay.
So in addition to Birmingham, it will be going to other venues.
Okay.
Thank you. We have a question back here. We have quite a few questions, and
Okay,
we're going to
where's
try to
it?
get to everybody.
Where's it? Okay. I'll see if I can see you back there. Hi.
Hi.
I have horrible vision. So.
Well, thank you, obviously, for coming to talk to us today about such an impactful piece in the show. I don't really necessarily have a question, much more a comment, mainly sort of connecting to what you were saying about the religious aspects of it. I think you're definitely very dead on with that, because I think the first thing I noticed, especially with the two sides, is that it also sort of is reminiscent of a choir. It has a very choir-like appearance, and especially when you're talking about the Black experience and the Black experience in America, as much as it is a bit of a complicated story or narrative, the way religion played into the stories of Black Americans and, just the survival, I think that is also something that is possibly, you can read into the piece as well, the religious, I want to say affectation of the inclusion of this sort of choral.
So that is super interesting, because I do see those the two groupings at either end doing something different. And I'd like to think a little harder about that, and what I mean is about these groups are not like typical of what we imagine the slave ship icon to look like. And so what you're suggesting is almost kind of a hosanna or looking upwards to something beyond, right? And I didn't want to go that far in interpretation, but I have been thinking that. So thank you for raising that issue.
We've got 2 questions. I'm going to come over there too. Oh, 3, but let's get to this one first.
Hello. I had a question about, as you were mentioning, how many images there are that was sculpted and what it took to do all that. So I was curious whether or not, when it was being restored, if there was any documentation to calculate how many images are actually sculpted in.
Good, that's a Brittany question. That's a good question. How many figures are on there?
And then the other to see if it, like when you was talking about it, it should travel. If anybody in the room was familiar with seeing Vessel, which was a silent play about the slave ship, and it was done at University of Penn, to imagine those in concert with one another, or even some of the books that you talked about, having the presentation of the slave ship with like an overall reading and processing of a book, or even a silent documentation of the slave ship, and it was processed afterward. They actually had rooms for people to process their experience without leaving the building, without processing what they just encountered.
You know, they're going to do that in Baltimore around an exhibition, is to have because they have some difficult images in this newly Joyce Scott exhibition. If you don't know Joyce Scott, run to BMA to see it, and I think next year it's opening. But actually, they set aside space for processing. Some of the really difficult, some of her work is really difficult. I mean, it's showing rape in beaded form, right? It's seductively beautiful, but how do audiences sometimes need to just sit and take a breath, right? And be mindful about what they're engaging. As to the figures, I think there's a no, but that's a good question that maybe we can get someone to count that. I was really also struck with you mentioning this play. There's a play in 1969 that's quite well known by Leroy Jones called The Slave Ship, right? That attempts to kind of reenact it, and it would be interesting to see either a reproduction of that or some kind of reading of that play, like in the context of this object as well. So I'm sorry we can't, right? There's no count?
There is no count.
There is no count.
I'm going to take one more question, or we can take one more question, I should say.
And are they behind the post?
They are.
My question is about responsible stewardship. Is it responsible stewardship to send that piece into areas, museums, where it is possibly destroyed? I mentioned to several people in the South, I am also from Birmingham, way back in the days, and everyone expressed alarm. Please don't. This is a beautiful piece. Please don't. So once again, I ask, what is responsible stewardship? Second question. You started with a number of books that came out when Rhoden began this piece. Rhoden came from an area where I am sure he saw photographs, if not in person, actual person, of people who were lynched. So what I'm missing here is the actual personal context in which he lived some version of that.
So that is, yes, lynching is why I make a connection to the lynching memorial. There is a whole underground postcard photography and I'll come back to stewardship, that's circulating, right, throughout the 20th century. There is an enormous exhibition that was in the 90s called Without Sanctuary. And I suspect even living in this part of the world, the experience or knowledge of someone who was lynched, right? This is a reality of being a Southerner. So I think, yes, lynched bodies for sure. And in fact, the noose suggests that. And if you look right here, there's actually a noose hanging off right here, off of that. What's so interesting is how little Rhoden talked about this, right? So there is very little archival discussion. So I guess my question to you is, do we not send out objects because people might destroy it or be uncomfortable? And I actually think we're at a point where these kinds of objects need to be seen, and if you're worried about destruction in Birmingham, then they need to hire extra security guards. And I say that because I think that we're at a moment of the denial of the history of slavery that is profound. We see it in Florida as perhaps obviously the best case that refused the African American AP exams, who have, the governor saying that slaves actually it was a good experience and they got something out of it. These are really simplified stories about enslavement in the United States. And I think what the slave ship icon has done over time is to remind us of the horror of it. So I would argue, no, it should not be put behind closed doors and never seen again and put into PAFA storage. I would say it has to travel. But then that is up to the museum to actually, first of all, initiate hard conversations about what the work of this object is. It is the museums. I know this is putting a lot of burden on museums, but if you're going to take this object, then you actually have to be willing to share in that burden of what it means to show objects like this. Now, obviously, for me, it's so tied, and I'm glad you raised this point about lynching. It is so tied to lynching in that sense of the middle, the historic lynching of bodies that began very early on. And that's another story that I think that Brian Stevenson's trying to tell, so it's not also erased from the historical record. And whether or not we think that monument does the work it needs to do is a different kind of conversation. But having been there on the opening weekend, it was the most profound experience I've ever had at a memorial, was in Montgomery at that site several years ago. So I really err on, if we don't tell this story, then it is going to be smothered out, the story of slavery in the United States. That is the intention right now, is to pretend that Black life was not difficult, to pretend that slavery did not exist, to write new narratives. And this, I'm not willing to stand by and watch this happen. It's why I keep doing my work. And I'll tell you an interesting story. I had a young artist email me recently and say, I want to be in your database. And I said, why? I'm applying for a grant. So I need a good reason why you think this is important. And she's from Chicago. There's an Underground Railroad memorial, so actually a pretty innocuous memorial. But her point is that this site that I run, Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past, effectively functions now as an anti-Confederate site. It is not why I developed my site. But it allows people to see that there are memorialization efforts. There are communities having conversations about slavery and the impact today. What does it mean to live in St. Mary's County in Maryland, which was on the side of the Confederacy, which had numerous plantations? What does it mean to memorialize slavery in that landscape today? What kind of conversations does it provoke among students, among descendants? This is really important. There are descendants at many of these sites. And I think someone mentioned Montpelier. Did someone mention Montpelier? But the whole problems of what happened at James Madison's Montpelier, trying to tell a new story and then trying to actually squeeze that story out of it, right? So I would say we got to keep talking about this stuff. We got to keep writing these histories, and we have to be, quite frankly, relentless about it. And telling the story. And it's not that they haven't been told, but there's an erasure happening that I see in this historic moment. So that's a long answer to your question. And I'm sorry I can't see you well because it's right behind the camera.
Do we have time? I'm not even sure what I'm going to say. We'll be especially coherent, so bear with me.
Kate's a curator from Birmingham.
I'm Kate Crawford.
Thank you, Lori. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Crawford. I'm the curator of American art at the Birmingham Museum of Art, and among many other things, I'm really excited to bring this exhibition to Birmingham in October of 2024. And I've been thinking a lot about this sculpture in the context of that. I'm not worried about the sculpture's safety at the Birmingham Museum of Art, although I'm happy to have a longer conversation about why that is and why perhaps I should be, although I'm not. Something I think about a lot in the context of this sculpture at the end of, in Brittany's presentation of the show, as a culmination really to this exhibition, in a lot of ways is how I can present it in Birmingham and give it that presence within his body of work, which I think it deserves. It's doing work that's very different from the rest of his body of work, and I think that's an important dimension to his practice, as you said exceptionally beautifully. The Birmingham Museum of Art was founded as a segregated organization. It's a department of the city of Birmingham. We have done a lot of very public reflection to acknowledge that history, continue working with that history, and also work to change the way our city sees our museum and not re-traumatize visitors as they're developing a new relationship with the museum. And I think the thing that I've been thinking about a lot in the context of presenting this sculpture in the Rhoden exhibition is how to share that history without having this be something that is so visceral. And for me, this is a really visceral sculpture to look at. That's so visceral that no matter what kind of, I can't have you stand next to the sculpture all of the time in our galleries. You know, I wish I could. We can talk about what that would cost.
And I have a day job.
Yeah, no, exactly. But you know, it's no matter how much interpretation you surround something with, there are things that are so visceral that I think particularly for in a proudly Black city like Birmingham, there is the risk of trauma and, you know, re-traumatizing visitors, no matter how lovingly you try to surround it, both with walls and interpretation. And that's just a difficult balance. There's not a question at the end of that, but I think it's something that I wouldn't mind you meditating on, and it's certainly something I'm thinking about.
Well, and I think, though, just very quickly, that I do think the idea of visitor space, like contemplative, and I really mean contemplative space, that's quiet, that you can sit down, that maybe you can journal if you want to, you could read more if you want, but we need more of those spaces, right, that allow us, when we encounter an object like this, to actually hit pause in the exhibition and sit down. And you've done that a little bit with the film. Allows a super interesting transition from the restoration to the object itself. But I do think there's even further ways to do this.
Yeah,
So.
and walls and content.
Exactly.
I don't know how you feel about that, but I do a lot of giving people a protective space and the option to opt out.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Dr. Ater.
thank you.
We'll reconvene at 3:40. Yeah, maybe in 15, 20 minutes, 3:40.